The following presentation is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. The automotive industry represents a highly complex economic sector, and purchasing, financing, or leasing a vehicle is often one of the most significant financial commitments an individual or family will make. The historical trends, market analyses, and specific manufacturer case studies discussed in this documentary do not constitute professional financial, investment, legal, or mechanical advice. The potential outcomes of market shifts, consumer trends, and historical data regarding vehicle depreciation, appreciation, or manufacturer reliability are not indicative of future results or guaranteed future market performance. Every consumer's financial situation, transportation requirements, and local market conditions are entirely unique. Viewers are strongly advised to conduct their own rigorous due diligence, utilize independent vehicle history reports, consult with certified financial planners, and seek the direct guidance of qualified, independent automotive professionals before executing any vehicle purchase, lease, or related financial transaction. Do not base any financial or purchasing decisions solely on the information provided in this broadcast. In 1957, a small, severely underpowered, and oddly proportioned car called the Toyota Crown rolled off a cargo ship onto American soil. It was the first Japanese passenger car ever officially exported to the United States, and it was, by every conceivable metric of the era, an absolute catastrophe. When ambitious executives attempted to drive the vehicle from Los Angeles to a regional dealership, the engine overheated spectacularly on the open road. The suspension was brutally stiff, engineered specifically to navigate the unpaved, deeply rutted, and heavily damaged roads of post-war Japan, not the smooth, high-speed, concrete expanses of President Eisenhower's newly constructed interstate highway system. At American highway speeds, the vehicle shook violently, its small displacement engine screaming as it struggled to maintain a mere 60 miles per hour. American automotive executives residing in Detroit, the undisputed, unchallenged kings of the global automotive industry who were busy designing massive, fin-tailed, V8-powered land yachts, literally laughed out loud. They dismissed these initial Asian imports as cheap, disposable novelties, confident that these structurally inferior foreign machines would never pose a legitimate, long-term threat to the American way of driving. Fast forward to the modern era, and the arrogant laughter once echoing out of Detroit boardrooms has been entirely replaced by the deafening silence of permanently closed assembly lines and massive corporate restructurings. Legacy American automakers have been forced into a desperate, heavily defensive retreat, with massive corporations systematically eliminating nearly their entire lineup of traditional passenger sedans in the United States domestic market, because they simply cannot compete on efficiency, reliability, or price. Meanwhile, the direct descendants of those initially mocked, underpowered imported vehicles now thoroughly dominate American roads and driveways. The Toyota Camry and Honda Accord have spent decades locked in a fierce, undisputed reign at the very top of the best-selling passenger car lists, moving millions of units year over year. Asian automotive manufacturers, once holding less than a fraction of a single % of the domestic market, executed what is arguably the most brilliant, methodical, and ruthless corporate conquest in the history of global capitalism. They did not just enter the American market. They entirely redefined the American consumer's foundational expectations of what an automobile should be, effectively rewriting the global rules of manufacturing efficiency, statistical quality control, and multi-generational consumer loyalty. But how did this highly improbable event happen? How did the laughingstock of the industrial world orchestrate a complete, undeniable takeover of the American driveway? And more importantly, what is the highly guarded, heavily funded next phase of this automotive evolution that is currently unfolding right in front of us? A phase that threatens to fundamentally disrupt the ongoing electric vehicle transition and potentially wipe out the remaining legacy manufacturers entirely. The current transition from the internal combustion engine to electric and alternative propulsion systems represents a critical, existential vulnerability for established markets, and the strategic maneuvers currently being deployed by Asian manufacturers in this new, high-stakes arena are completely distinct from their mid-century survival tactics. This in-depth documentary series will precisely decode the exact engineering milestones, sophisticated economic warfare, and profound psychological shifts that allowed Asian car models to systematically conquer the American market. For the average American consumer, thoroughly understanding this historical evolution is not merely an academic exercise in corporate history. It is an absolute necessity for protecting your personal wealth. The typical American household loses tens of thousands of dollars over a lifetime, due to catastrophic vehicle depreciation, predatory and unexpected maintenance cycles, and fundamentally flawed purchasing decisions driven by outdated, historically inaccurate brand perceptions. By critically analyzing the historical trends and specific case studies of these automotive giants, you will gain a profound, actionable understanding of the hidden macroeconomic forces sitting right now in your driveway. We are going to dissect the specific step-by-step mechanical methodologies that allowed companies like Honda to legally and brilliantly bypass stringent American emissions regulations without the use of complex, power-draining catalytic converters in the 1970s, stunning the vast engineering departments of Detroit's Big Three. We will explore the rigorous, almost obsessive operational frameworks like the globally studied Toyota production system, which turned vehicle manufacturing from a brute force, highly wasteful industrial process into a highly synchronized, waste-eliminating science based on continuous improvement. You will clearly understand how the concept of reliability transitioned from a subjective, easily manipulated marketing buzzword into a rigorously engineered, statistically proven reality that actively preserves consumer capital and firmly dictates secondary market valuations across the globe. Furthermore, we will deeply analyze the precise, heavily funded psychological operations required to pivot an entire corporate brand identity from economy to prestige. We will examine the secret executive board meetings and billions of dollars in stealth research and development that ultimately culminated in the unprecedented launch of luxury marques like Lexus, Acura, and Infiniti in the late 1980s. These new brands did not just offer slightly better leather seats and quieter cabins. They weaponized precision engineering, flawless reliability, and unparalleled, highly choreographed dealership experiences to completely shatter the long-standing European monopoly on the American luxury car market. We will look at the exact, verifiable data points that demonstrate how a newly invented brand like Lexus was able to immediately capture the attention and capital of fiercely loyal Mercedes-Benz and BMW owners, successfully shifting the paradigm of luxury from mere historical heritage to undisputed, frictionless daily functionality. We will also track the massive secondary wave of the Asian automotive invasion, the rapid rise of the South Korean manufacturers, specifically Hyundai and Kia. Their initial entry into the American market in the 1980s with models like the Excel heavily mirrored the initial Japanese struggles. Experiencing massive unexpected early sales followed rapidly by catastrophic, brand-destroying quality crises that temporarily turned the companies into late-night television punchlines. Yet, through a brutal combination of aggressive corporate restructuring, ruthless internal quality control enhancements, and the incredibly bold implementation of an unprecedented, industry-shocking 10-year, 100,000-mile powertrain warranty, they achieved one of the greatest brand rehabilitations in modern corporate history. They proved to the industry that with enough liquid capital and a calculated willingness to absorb massive short-term financial liabilities to guarantee long-term consumer trust, a deeply tarnished brand could not only survive a near-death experience but eventually rise to challenge the very Japanese giants that paved their way into the market. Today, as we stand on the precipice of a total global propulsion revolution, deeply understanding these past corporate strategies is the only viable way to accurately assess the potential outcomes of tomorrow's automotive market. Will highly subsidized Chinese automotive manufacturers execute a similar, aggressive penetration of the United States market through aggressively priced, technology-heavy electric vehicles, successfully bypassing the decades of slow brand building required by their predecessors? Or are the established Japanese and Korean industrial titans currently holding back a massive, highly calculated defensive strategy designed to completely crush new market entrants while simultaneously starving legacy American brands of their remaining market share? By thoroughly and objectively examining the long-term evolution of Asian car models in the United States, you will be firmly equipped with the analytical tools required to navigate the modern automotive market, anticipate massive macroeconomic shifts, and make highly informed, financially sound decisions in an industry specifically designed to separate you from your capital. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this market shift, we must transport ourselves back to the definitive inflection point of modern automotive history, which occurred during the massive geopolitical upheaval of the 1970s. The American automotive landscape prior to 1973 was fundamentally defined by an era of cheap, abundant petroleum and an absolute obsession with massive displacement internal combustion engines. Domestic manufacturers in Detroit were engaged in a fierce, multi-decade horsepower war, producing incredibly heavy, fundamentally inefficient vehicles that routinely achieved single-digit fuel economy figures. These rolling fortresses of steel and chrome were entirely dependent on an uninterrupted flow of inexpensive gasoline, a critical vulnerability that the global oil embargo of 1973 exposed with devastating consequences. Imagine, if you will, the daily reality for an average American consumer during this crisis. Consider someone like David, a typical suburban commuter facing long drives to the office. If David were facing a similar, sudden energy shock in the current year of 2026, where regional fuel infrastructure completely collapsed overnight and energy prices skyrocketed beyond affordability, the financial panic would be immediate and life-altering. In the 1970s, the reality was precisely that severe. Americans found themselves trapped in miles-long lines at fuel stations, waiting for hours simply to purchase a rationed, highly restricted volume of gasoline based entirely on whether their vehicle license plate ended in an odd or even number. This sudden, violently imposed scarcity completely shattered the American illusion of unlimited energy and instantly transformed the gas-guzzling domestic V8 engine from a symbol of ultimate freedom and status into a massive, heavily burdensome financial liability. This precise moment of absolute domestic vulnerability created the perfect structural opening for Asian manufacturers, specifically Japanese automakers, to transition from fringe novelty brands to essential economic lifelines for the American middle class. The historical trends observed during this era provide one of the most compelling case studies in corporate agility and technological opportunism. While American automotive executives scrambled defensively, heavily lobbying the federal government to delay the implementation of newly drafted, highly stringent emissions regulations mandated by the Clean Air Act, Japanese engineers were operating under a completely different paradigm. Detroit publicly argued that meeting these new federal mandates was technologically impossible without completely sacrificing vehicle performance and significantly increasing manufacturing costs, heavily relying on expensive, highly restrictive bolt-on catalytic converters that severely choked engine output and drastically reduced overall mechanical reliability. Honda Motor Company, however, approached this massive regulatory hurdle not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a tremendous opportunity for global market penetration. They initiated a relentless research and development campaign that ultimately yielded one of the most significant engineering breakthroughs of the 20th century, which was the compound vortex controlled combustion engine, universally recognized by the acronym CVCC. Instead of trying to filter out toxic exhaust gases after combustion occurred, which was the brute force American approach, Honda engineers fundamentally redesigned the internal combustion process itself to prevent those toxic emissions from forming in the first place. Let us break down the exact step-by-step mechanical genius of the CVCC system. Traditional engines of that era utilized a single combustion chamber where a uniform mixture of fuel and air was ignited by the spark plug. To meet emission standards without a catalytic converter, the mixture had to be exceptionally lean, meaning it contained significantly more air than fuel. However, igniting a purely lean mixture is highly difficult and typically results in inconsistent engine performance, severe stalling, and terrible drivability. Honda brilliantly solved this complex thermodynamic problem by introducing a secondary, much smaller pre-combustion chamber located directly adjacent to the primary cylinder. The mechanical sequence operated like this. First, a specialized carburetor delivered a very rich, highly combustible fuel and air mixture specifically into this tiny pre-chamber, while simultaneously delivering a very lean, highly efficient mixture into the main cylinder. Next, the spark plug, strategically positioned inside the pre-chamber, easily ignited the rich mixture. Finally, this initial highly energetic ignition created a powerful flame front that blasted through a small passage into the main cylinder, forcefully and completely igniting the larger, leaner mixture that a standard spark plug could never have ignited efficiently on its own. The potential outcomes of this brilliant engineering methodology were instantly transformative for the global automotive market. When Honda introduced the Civic CVCC to the United States market, it achieved full compliance with the strict 1975 federal emissions standards entirely without the use of a heavy, expensive, and power-draining catalytic converter. Furthermore, the vehicle delivered unprecedented fuel efficiency, routinely exceeding 40 miles per gallon at a time when domestic vehicles struggled to achieve 15. For consumers desperately attempting to survive the brutal economic realities of the oil crisis and rampant inflation, the Honda Civic was not merely a convenient alternative transportation option. It was an absolute financial necessity. The profound psychological impact of this specific technological victory cannot be overstated. American consumers who had historically viewed Japanese imports with deep suspicion and outright derision suddenly realized that these foreign manufacturers were actively solving their daily, agonizing financial problems while domestic manufacturers were simply offering endless excuses and inferior, poorly adapted technology. The brand perception of Asian automakers fundamentally shifted from producers of cheap, disposable metal boxes to the undisputed leaders of high efficiency, highly intelligent, and incredibly reliable advanced engineering. This foundational shift in consumer trust generated a massive wave of brand loyalty that completely disrupted the historical dominance of the big three domestic automakers, resulting in millions of deeply frustrated American buyers permanently abandoning their traditional domestic brand allegiances. This initial wave of market penetration, driven entirely by the undeniable necessity for fuel efficiency and the brilliant implementation of the CVCC technology, successfully established a highly profitable, rapidly expanding beachhead for Asian manufacturers on American soil. They had successfully proven that they could out-engineer Detroit during a major crisis, capturing a significant percentage of the highly coveted entry-level passenger car market. However, simply possessing a highly efficient engine was not nearly enough to completely dismantle the deeply entrenched industrial complex of American automotive manufacturing. To move beyond the compact economy car segment and systematically dominate every single vehicle category, including mid-size family sedans and eventually highly profitable sports utility vehicles, these foreign challengers required something far more disruptive than just advanced thermodynamics. They needed to entirely reinvent the fundamental physics and financial economics of how an automobile was physically constructed from the ground up, an undertaking that would require a radical departure from the traditional mass production methodologies originally invented by Henry Ford. They needed to introduce an operational philosophy so alien and so remarkably efficient that it would completely paralyze domestic factories and force American executives to completely rethink the very nature of industrial labor, waste elimination, and statistical quality control. To fundamentally understand how Asian automakers achieve this unparalleled operational supremacy, we must deeply analyze the absolute paradigm shift known globally as the Toyota production system. While American automotive executives were rigidly adhering to the mass production blueprints originally drafted by Henry Ford in the early 20th century, engineers in Japan, specifically under the visionary leadership of Taiichi Ohno, were quietly developing a manufacturing philosophy born out of severe post-war resource scarcity. The traditional Detroit methodology was heavily reliant on a push production system. In this outdated model, factories would relentlessly manufacture massive quantities of individual automotive components regardless of immediate consumer demand. These parts were then stockpiled in colossal, highly expensive warehouses, tying up billions of dollars in dormant liquid capital. When a vehicle rolled down an American assembly line in the 1970s and 1980s, the primary objective was uninterrupted volume. If a worker discovered a misaligned door hinge or a faulty transmission installation, the standard protocol was to ignore the defect, keep the assembly line moving at all costs, and send the flawed vehicle to a massive repair lot at the end of the line where specialized mechanics would attempt to forcefully correct the structural errors before shipping the car to a dealership. This brute force approach resulted in catastrophic quality control failures, massive warranty payouts, and deeply frustrated consumers who essentially served as the final quality inspectors. Consider an imagine-if scenario set in our current year of 2026. Imagine if Michael, a commercial fleet manager purchasing hundreds of service vehicles for a national logistics company, discovered that 10% of his newly delivered cargo vans required immediate, significant transmission overhauls right off the delivery truck. The financial devastation, lost productivity, and logistical nightmare would immediately bankrupt a modern logistics operation. Yet, this exact scenario was an entirely accepted, mathematically factored cost of doing business for the big three domestic automakers during the late 20th century. They normalized catastrophic failure. The Toyota production system completely annihilated this inherently flawed methodology by introducing two foundational pillars that would permanently alter global industrial economics. The first pillar is just-in-time manufacturing. Instead of pushing excess inventory into massive warehouses, Toyota engineered a highly synchronized pull system. Components were manufactured and delivered to the exact station on the assembly line precisely at the exact moment they were required for installation, and not a single second earlier. This was meticulously orchestrated using a physical signaling system called Kanban, which triggered upstream production only when downstream supply was physically depleted. By entirely eliminating the need for massive warehousing and the associated holding costs, Toyota freed up billions of dollars in operating capital, allowing them to heavily reinvest in advanced research and development while simultaneously aggressively undercutting domestic competitors on retail pricing. However, just-in-time manufacturing would instantly collapse if the individual components were defective, which leads directly to the second profoundly disruptive pillar of the Toyota production system, known as Jidoka. Jidoka translates to automation with a human touch, and it represents a radical psychological departure from the traditional American labor dynamic. In a Detroit factory, a line worker was treated as a disposable, highly repetitive biological machine whose only job was to attach a specific part as fast as possible. In a Toyota facility, every single assembly line worker was granted the absolute authority and the strict operational mandate to physically halt the entire multi-million-dollar production line the instant they detected any manufacturing abnormality. They achieved this by pulling a physical rope called an andon cord. When the cord was pulled, the line stopped, a massive visual indicator illuminated the factory floor, and highly trained engineering supervisors immediately rushed to the specific workstation to diagnose and completely permanently eliminate the root cause of the defect. This philosophy completely inverted the traditional power dynamic of industrial manufacturing. Instead of hiding mistakes and pushing defective products to the end of the line, the Toyota production methodology actively hunted for errors in real time. This relentless pursuit of perfection was further amplified by the cultural concept of Kaizen, or continuous incremental improvement. Every single employee, from the floor sweeper to the chief executive officer, was expected to constantly analyze their immediate workflow and suggest marginal efficiency gains. Over decades, these tiny, seemingly insignificant micro-adjustments compounded mathematically into an insurmountable competitive advantage. The historical trends and statistical data from the 1980s clearly illustrate the devastating potential outcomes of this operational divergence. By 1982, independent industry analysts rigorously documenting defects per 100 vehicles revealed a shocking reality. Japanese imported vehicles were rolling off the cargo ships with fundamentally flawless structural integrity, heavily outperforming domestic models that were plagued by electrical failures, severe panel gaps, and catastrophic drivetrain malfunctions. The American consumer, previously loyal to domestic brands out of pure generational habit, rapidly discovered that purchasing a Toyota Corolla or a Honda Accord meant completely avoiding the dreaded, highly expensive weekend trips to the local mechanic. Asian vehicles were not just highly efficient during a fuel crisis, they simply refused to break down. This statistical reliability directly translated into an unprecedented retention of capital for the consumer. Because these vehicles lasted significantly longer without requiring massive repair investments, their secondary market valuation skyrocketed. A used Japanese sedan became a highly liquid, incredibly stable asset, while a 5-year-old American domestic vehicle depreciated into virtually worthless scrap metal. Through the ruthless, highly disciplined application of the Toyota production system, Asian manufacturers successfully conquered the absolute foundation of the American automotive market. They thoroughly dominated the entry-level compact and mid-size sedan categories by offering an undeniable, mathematically proven value proposition based entirely on fuel efficiency and multi-generational mechanical reliability. They severely financially crippled the domestic automakers in the high-volume, low-margin economy sectors, forcing Detroit to retreat heavily into the highly profitable, structurally protected realm of pickup trucks and massive sports utility vehicles. However, manufacturing highly reliable, economically priced transportation modules was merely the foundational stage of a much larger, incredibly ambitious macroeconomic war. While dominating the middle class provided massive operational scale and tremendous cash flow, the true financial power and global prestige of the automotive industry resided in a completely different, highly exclusive sector. Asian automotive executives sitting in boardrooms in Tokyo recognized that to achieve absolute, total market supremacy in the United States, they could not remain permanently relegated to the economy class. They had to systematically dismantle the most deeply entrenched, highly emotional, and aggressively guarded segment of the global automotive hierarchy. They had to mathematically engineer and forcefully execute a highly coordinated assault against the absolute pinnacle of European and American automotive royalty, a maneuver so completely audacious that industry analysts at the time considered it corporate suicide. They had to invent entirely new, mathematically perfect brands specifically designed to completely destroy Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Cadillac in the most profitable demographic in the world. To fully grasp the magnitude of this audacious strategy, we must first examine a fascinating piece of macroeconomic legislation that unintentionally accelerated this luxury invasion and forever altered historical trends in the automotive sector. In 1981, the United States government, heavily pressured by a panicking Detroit establishment that was rapidly bleeding market share, negotiated what was known as the voluntary export restraints with Japan. This political maneuver strictly capped the number of Japanese vehicles allowed to be imported into the United States at 1.68 million units per year. The American logic was straightforward. Limit the volume of cheap imported cars to give domestic manufacturers time to retool and recover. However, this artificial restriction created a massive, unintended economic incentive for Asian manufacturers. If an automaker is legally barred from increasing the total volume of vehicles they sell, the only mathematical path to increasing corporate revenue and profit margins is to aggressively increase the price and the profit margin of every single unit exported. They could no longer rely solely on selling millions of inexpensive economy cars. They were structurally forced to build highly profitable luxury vehicles. Honda was the primary pioneer in this high-stakes transition, executing a brilliant corporate maneuver by launching the Acura brand in 1986. By physically separating their new luxury models, the Legend and the Integra, from the standard Honda dealership network, they initiated a profound psychological experiment on the American consumer. They needed to prove that buyers would be willing to spend premium capital on a Japanese vehicle if it was presented within an exclusive, highly refined environment. The potential outcomes of this experiment were initially heavily debated by industry analysts, but the immediate sales success of Acura proved that the American public was completely exhausted by the unreliable, excessively heavy domestic luxury cars of the era, and was desperate for precision engineering, even if it lacked a European crest on the hood. However, while Honda tested the waters, Toyota was secretly preparing to unleash a fiscal and engineering tsunami that would completely redefine the global luxury standard. In 1983, Toyota chairman Eiji Toyota convened a highly classified meeting of his top executives and engineers, issuing a single seemingly impossible directive: build the finest luxury automobile in the world. This initiative, heavily shrouded in corporate secrecy, was codenamed Project F1, standing for Flagship 1. What followed was arguably the most intense, heavily funded, and obsessive research and development campaign in the history of the automobile. Toyota completely ignored their standard, highly efficient development cycles. Instead, they deployed an astonishing $1 billion in capital, utilizing the relentless labor of 60 designers, 1,400 engineers, 2,300 technicians, and over 200 support workers. The engineering parameters for Project F1 were entirely uncompromising. The vehicle had to achieve a top speed of 150 miles per hour, deliver an unprecedented 22 miles per gallon, and possess a cabin so exceptionally quiet that occupants could converse in whispers at highway speeds. To achieve these extreme metrics, Toyota engineers constructed over 450 physical prototypes and subjected them to nearly 3 million miles of rigorous testing across the harshest environments on the planet, from the freezing winters of Northern Europe to the blistering deserts of the American Southwest. They entirely re-engineered the aerodynamic profile of the traditional luxury sedan to eliminate wind noise, and they developed a revolutionary 4-liter V8 engine, the 1UZ-FE, manufactured with incredibly tight tolerances that completely eliminated internal mechanical vibrations. Imagine, if you will, a scenario in our current year of 2026. Imagine if an overseas technology company, historically known strictly for producing highly durable but incredibly basic budget smartphones for teenagers, suddenly released a massive, ultra-premium enterprise server system that completely outperformed the most expensive, deeply entrenched American legacy tech giants by every conceivable metric, consumed half the electricity, never crashed, and cost exactly half the price. The corporate world would be completely paralyzed by the shock. This is precisely what happened when Toyota officially unveiled the Lexus LS 400 to the American market in 1989. To publicly demonstrate this absolute engineering supremacy, Lexus launched a television marketing campaign featuring a historical case study in advertising brilliance. They placed a pyramid of delicate, crystal champagne glasses directly on the hood of a running Lexus LS 400 on a dynamometer. As the vehicle accelerated to 145 miles per hour, the engine operated with such profound, mathematically perfect balance that not a single drop of liquid vibrated out of the glasses. It was a visual masterpiece of engineering intimidation, but the final, most devastating blow to the European monopoly was the retail price. The Lexus LS 400 launched with a base price of roughly $38,000, massively undercutting the comparable Mercedes-Benz and BMW flagship sedans, which routinely commanded well over $70,000. It was an act of total economic warfare. Yet, the brilliant engineering and aggressive pricing were only two-thirds of the Lexus strategy. The final critical component that permanently secured their dominance was the complete reinvention of the American dealership experience. Historically, purchasing a vehicle in the United States was an adversarial, deeply stressful, and fundamentally unpleasant transaction. Dealerships were viewed as hostile environments designed to extract maximum capital through high-pressure sales tactics. Lexus systematically dismantled this model. They heavily mandated that every Lexus dealership resemble a luxury boutique hotel rather than a traditional car lot. Salespeople were trained to act as concierges, treating customers as highly esteemed guests. This relentless commitment to consumer satisfaction was immediately put to the ultimate test just months after the LS400 launched. In late 1989, Lexus discovered a minor defect involving a cruise control wire and a faulty brake light housing. Instead of quietly ignoring the issue or forcing customers to wait for hours in dingy repair bays, which was the standard domestic industry practice, Lexus executed a massive, unprecedented voluntary recall. They personally contacted every single owner, dispatched representatives to pick up the vehicles directly from the owner's driveways, provided complimentary luxury loaner vehicles, completely resolved the mechanical issues, washed and detailed the cars, filled the fuel tanks entirely at their own expense, and returned the vehicles to the owners. This astonishing display of corporate accountability and white-glove service transformed a potential public relations disaster into a legendary case study of brand loyalty. Buyers who had previously tolerated the arrogant, indifferent service departments of legacy European brands instantly abandoned their historical allegiances and transferred their wealth to Lexus. Through the flawless execution of Acura, Lexus, and eventually Nissan's Infiniti brand, the Japanese automakers successfully conquered the most heavily fortified, fiercely defended segment of the American market. They proved they could out-engineer, outprice, and absolutely outservice the most prestigious legacy manufacturers on Earth. They had completely rewritten the rules of automotive luxury, leaving domestic and European executives entirely shell-shocked and desperately scrambling to redesign their own fundamental corporate operations just to survive the onslaught. The Japanese hegemony over the American driveway seemed totally absolute, an impregnable fortress of market share spanning from the cheapest economy hatchbacks to the most opulent flagship sedans. However, this total dominance created a massive, unforeseen blind spot. While Toyota and Honda were completely focused on destroying Mercedes and BMW, they entirely ignored a subtle, rapidly accelerating threat quietly brewing across the Sea of Japan, a deeply ambitious, heavily subsidized industrial powerhouse that was meticulously studying the exact playbook the Japanese had just used to conquer America, and they were preparing to deploy an unprecedented, industry-shattering financial weapon that would forever change the concept of automotive liability. This brewing industrial powerhouse was South Korea, and their initial assault on the American market in the 1980s serves as one of the most volatile and profoundly educational case studies in modern corporate history. In 1986, the Hyundai Motor Company arrived in the United States with a single highly ambitious vehicle called the Excel. The macroeconomic timing appeared utterly perfect. Japanese manufacturers, severely restricted by the voluntary export quotas we previously discussed, had aggressively moved their product lines upmarket, creating a massive, highly lucrative vacuum at the absolute bottom of the pricing spectrum. Hyundai expertly exploited this exact vulnerability, launching the Excel with a jaw-dropping base price of just $4,995. The consumer response was instantaneous and explosive. Hyundai sold over 168,000 units in their very first year of operation, completely shattering all previous historical records for a first-year imported brand. Working-class American families, desperate for affordable brand-new transportation, flooded into hastily constructed dealership networks. However, the historical trends of drastically rushed manufacturing and deeply inadequate quality control violently caught up with the company almost immediately. The Hyundai Excel was fundamentally flawed on a mechanical level. The vehicles utilized outdated, licensed powertrain technology that was completely unprepared for the brutal, high-speed demands of American interstate driving. Within months of purchase, consumers experienced catastrophic transmission failures, heavily cracked engine blocks, severely peeling clear coat paint, and interior components that literally disintegrated under the intense summer heat. Hyundai rapidly devolved from an economic miracle into a brutal late-night television punchline. The brand perception plummeted so deeply and so severely that their vehicles were widely considered disposable, financially hazardous liabilities by the early 1990s. To clearly understand the severity of this consumer backlash, imagine a highly plausible scenario set in our current year of 2026. Imagine if a hardworking consumer named Robert, facing unprecedented inflationary pressures, purchased a heavily marketed, heavily discounted entry-level electric commuter vehicle from a newly established overseas startup. If the high-voltage battery pack in Robert's vehicle completely degraded and the proprietary operating software permanently crashed within the first 6 months of a demanding 72-month financing agreement, and the manufacturer subsequently refused to honor the repair costs, Robert would be completely financially trapped. He would owe tens of thousands of dollars on a totally inoperable brick of a vehicle. The reputational damage to that manufacturer would be instantly fatal in the modern digital age. This intense, absolute financial terror was the exact reality Hyundai faced. They were bleeding massive amounts of capital, aggressively hemorrhaging market share, and facing the very real, imminent threat of total expulsion from the highly lucrative United States market. To survive this catastrophic public relations nightmare, the South Korean executives required a masterstroke of corporate psychological warfare. They realized that traditional marketing campaigns and minor engineering tweaks would be completely ignored by a deeply burned, highly skeptical American public. In 1998, under the ruthless, visionary leadership of Chairman Chung Mong-koo, Hyundai executed a strategic maneuver so deeply contrarian and financially perilous that veteran industry analysts on Wall Street openly predicted it would bankrupt the entire multinational corporation within a decade. They introduced the Hyundai Advantage, an unprecedented, heavily marketed 10-year, 100,000-mile powertrain warranty. We must deeply analyze the specific mathematical and psychological brilliance of this exact policy. This was not a standard automotive marketing gimmick. It was a legally binding massive transfer of financial risk directly from the working-class consumer back to the multi-billion-dollar manufacturer. At a time when legacy American and Japanese automakers were strictly offering highly limited 3-year, 36,000-mile warranties, Hyundai effectively told the American public that they mathematically guaranteed the long-term structural integrity of their engines and transmissions. By offering a warranty more than double the industry standard, they weaponized liability. If a transmission violently failed at 80,000 miles, the massive corporation would absorb the catastrophic repair costs, fully protecting the consumer's capital. However, a warranty of this immense magnitude would absolutely trigger immediate corporate bankruptcy if the vehicles continued to fail at their historical rates. Therefore, the external public warranty was merely the psychological shield for a brutal, fundamental internal operational restructuring. Chairman Chung instituted draconian, heavily enforced quality control measures across all South Korean manufacturing facilities. Hyundai and their recently acquired sister company, Kia, completely overhauled their manufacturing tolerances. They deeply integrated advanced robotics and implemented statistically rigorous defect elimination protocols that rivaled, and in some metrics exceeded, the legendary Toyota production system. The executives had absolutely no choice. Every single defective engine block that rolled off the assembly line in Ulsan now represented a massive, long-term financial liability directly tied to their own corporate balance sheet. They also heavily invested billions of dollars in specialized research and development facilities in Michigan and California, specifically engineering suspension geometries, climate control systems, and interior ergonomics explicitly tailored to the heavy, high-speed demands of the American driver. By aggressively neutralizing the massive negative perception regarding their mechanical reliability, South Korean manufacturers successfully secured their foundational position as the undisputed dominant purveyors of value-oriented transportation in the United States. They effectively captured the exact market segment that the Japanese had strategically abandoned when they moved heavily upmarket to chase massive luxury profit margins. However, simply surviving the brutal American market and actively thriving within it are two entirely different mathematical equations. The Korean Executive Board recognized that competing solely on absolute lowest price and a massive, heavily subsidized warranty was a highly defensive, low-margin strategy that would ultimately lead to corporate stagnation. To achieve the massive high-margin global dominance they deeply desired, they could not just build cars that refused to break. They had to build cars that the American public fundamentally lusted after. They needed to completely eradicate the lingering stigma of the cheap economy car and engineer a highly emotional, deeply visceral connection with the consumer. And to accomplish this seemingly impossible psychological transformation, they executed a highly classified, multi-million-dollar corporate raid, aggressively poaching the most brilliant, highly coveted design executives directly from the absolute top tier of the European luxury establishment, setting the stage for a dramatic visual revolution that would completely blindside the entire global industry. This dramatic visual revolution began with arguably the most significant corporate poaching operation in modern automotive history. In 2006, the executive board of Kia Motors executed a highly classified recruitment strategy, explicitly targeting a man named Peter Schreier. To understand the gravity of this acquisition, you must understand Schreier's historical pedigree. He was a titan of German automotive design, heavily entrenched in the rigid, mathematically perfect, and highly prestigious European establishment. He was the mastermind behind the iconic Audi TT, and was instrumental in the sweeping visual resurgence of the entire Volkswagen brand throughout the late 1990s. Why would a designer of his massive global stature leave the absolute pinnacle of European luxury to join a South Korean manufacturer, historically known for producing incredibly bland, purely utilitarian economy hatchbacks? The answer lies in corporate agility. Kia offered Schreier something legacy European automakers rarely provide to their executives: absolute, unquestioned creative control over an entire global brand's visual identity, and a massive influx of liquid capital to execute his vision without bureaucratic interference. The core problem Schreier faced upon his arrival was that Kia vehicles were visually anonymous. They lacked any cohesive structural DNA. If you physically removed the manufacturer badge from the hood, a consumer would have absolutely no idea who engineered the vehicle. Schreier immediately instituted a foundational design philosophy that completely overhauled the entire manufacturing lineup from the ground up. He developed the now legendary Tiger Nose grille, a distinct, highly aggressive corporate face that instantly communicated structural strength, engineering precision, and architectural confidence. It was not merely a cosmetic plastic upgrade bolted onto the front bumper. It was a profound psychological anchor. Schreier fundamentally altered the physical proportions of the vehicles, aggressively pushing the wheels out to the far corners of the chassis, lowering the rooflines to improve aerodynamic drag coefficients, and tightening the sheet metal to create a muscular, planted stance historically reserved strictly for highly expensive German sports sedans. Simultaneously, Hyundai was executing its own massive visual transformation. Through a deeply complex design language, they officially named fluidic sculpture. To fully appreciate the manufacturing complexity of this shift, we must analyze the physical limitations of steel stamping. Historically, economy cars featured flat, boxy side panels because stamping complex, sweeping curves into high-tensile steel requires incredibly expensive, highly advanced robotic factory tooling. Domestic American manufacturers routinely avoided these complex stampings on their entry-level sedans to strictly preserve profit margins. Hyundai, heavily leveraging their massive, highly integrated steel manufacturing subsidiary, systematically absorbed these massive tooling costs. When they launched the 2011 Hyundai Sonata, it completely shattered the aesthetic expectations of the mid-size sedan segment. It featured aggressive, plunging character lines that cascaded down the side profile, mimicking the heavily stylized premium aesthetic of a Mercedes-Benz CLS four-door coupe, but priced exactly like a standard family commuter car. Imagine, if you will, a highly plausible consumer scenario in our current year of 2026. Imagine a young professional named Sarah, attempting to navigate a fiercely competitive corporate environment while managing a heavily constrained household budget due to unprecedented macroeconomic inflation. Sarah requires a vehicle that actively projects professional success, aesthetic refinement, and upward mobility to her peers and clients. If Sarah is physically standing on a dealership lot, forced to choose between a visually sterile, severely uninspired legacy domestic sedan and a striking, architecturally bold imported vehicle that looks mathematically twice its actual retail price, the purchasing decision completely shifts from a purely utilitarian calculation to a deeply emotional investment. She will gladly transfer her capital to the manufacturer that actively elevates her perceived social status without permanently destroying her personal balance sheet. This exact psychological trigger is what the South Korean manufacturers successfully weaponized. The potential outcomes of this aggressive aesthetic strategy were immediate and financially staggering. Dealerships that historically had to heavily discount their inventory just to move units suddenly found consumers actively waiting in line, completely willing to pay full retail sticker price. The secondary market valuations of these specific models stabilized even further because the vehicles were no longer considered disposable transportation appliances. They were considered highly desirable assets. Asian manufacturers had successfully proven that they could mathematically engineer reliability and subsequently drape it in globally competitive, highly emotional design. However, looking aggressive and possessing a striking silhouette was only the initial phase of this sophisticated European raid. The executives in Seoul fully recognized that to truly command long-term respect and completely dismantle the lingering historical perception of dynamic inferiority, they needed to conquer the absolute final frontier of the automotive market. They needed to master high-performance, track-capable engineering. They realized that American consumers deeply associate handling dynamics, chassis stiffness, and high-speed stability with premium manufacturing quality. Therefore, Hyundai and Kia aggressively returned to Germany to execute another massive corporate strike. This time, they specifically targeted Albert Biermann, the legendary head of engineering for BMW's globally revered M division. Biermann had spent decades meticulously engineering some of the most highly respected, dynamically perfect performance vehicles on the planet. By successfully luring him to South Korea, they initiated a massive internal audit of their entire engineering process. Biermann ruthlessly evaluated their suspension geometries, heavily criticized their steering calibration, and demanded the implementation of ultra-high-strength steel in critical chassis stress points. His rigorous German engineering methodologies directly resulted in the creation of the Kia Stinger, a highly capable rear-wheel drive sports sedan that legitimately challenged established European rivals on the Nürburgring test track, and the launch of Hyundai's high-performance N division, which successfully introduced legitimate track-day capabilities to the affordable compact segment. This aggressive, highly calculated culmination of elite European design philosophy and rigorous German dynamic engineering ultimately provided the foundational confidence for an entirely new, highly audacious macroeconomic endeavor, the official launch of the Genesis luxury brand. Much like Toyota did with the Lexus division decades earlier, Hyundai's executive board recognized that to extract massive, multi-generational profit margins from the wealthiest American demographics, they needed to physically separate their ultimate engineering achievements from the standard, value-oriented dealership network. They needed a standalone luxury marque capable of competing directly with the most entrenched legacy brands in the world. But launching a brand new luxury division in the 2010s presented a fundamentally different, significantly more perilous macroeconomic challenge than launching Lexus in the 1980s. The luxury market was now completely saturated, consumer loyalty was heavily entrenched across multiple generations, and the sheer cost of capturing a single percentage point of market share required billions of dollars in highly targeted marketing and unprecedented concierge-level dealership infrastructure. Furthermore, as Genesis was attempting to establish its foundational footing, a massive, highly disruptive technological revolution was silently building momentum in the background, a complete paradigm shift in automotive propulsion that would heavily threaten to render the internal combustion engine completely obsolete and systematically force every single Asian legacy manufacturer into a desperate, heavily underfunded race for their very survival against a highly unconventional, heavily capitalized American startup based entirely in Silicon Valley. The highly unconventional, heavily capitalized American startup was, of course, Tesla, and their explosive arrival fundamentally shattered the established rules of global automotive supremacy. For decades, the undisputed competitive advantage of Asian legacy manufacturers, particularly the Japanese giants like Toyota and Honda, was their absolute mastery of the internal combustion engine. They had spent billions of capital and millions of engineering hours mathematically perfecting the complex thermodynamics, the excruciatingly tight mechanical tolerances, and the intricate multi-stage transmissions required to efficiently burn fossil fuels. Then, seemingly overnight, a technology company operating out of Palo Alto completely bypassed this massive competitive moat. Tesla did not attempt to build a better engine. They aggressively rendered the internal combustion engine structurally irrelevant. They transformed the automobile from a highly complex mechanical apparatus into a massive, rolling lithium-ion battery pack, controlled entirely by proprietary, continuously updating software. The historical trends surrounding this precise technological inflection point reveal a devastating psychological blind spot within the boardrooms of the Asian automotive establishment. When the Tesla Model S launched, domestic legacy automakers and foreign importers alike severely underestimated its potential outcomes. They viewed electric vehicles purely through the lens of early fundamentally flawed compliance cars. It is critical to analyze the specific case study of the Nissan Leaf to understand this historical failure. In 2010, Nissan successfully beat the rest of the industry to the mass market by launching the Leaf, a relatively affordable, fully electric commuter vehicle. However, Nissan fundamentally misunderstood the American consumer's deep psychological requirement for range security and aesthetic prestige. The Leaf featured a highly polarizing, deeply unconventional design that screamed economic compromise, and more fatally, it utilized an entirely passive battery cooling system. This meant the lithium-ion cells were highly susceptible to rapid, catastrophic thermal degradation, especially in extreme American climates like Arizona or Texas. Consumers rapidly discovered their already limited driving range heavily deteriorating within just a few years of ownership, completely destroying the vehicle's secondary market valuation and deeply poisoning the well for early electric vehicle adoption. In stark contrast, the Silicon Valley approach treated the electric vehicle as an aspirational luxury technology product. By heavily investing in a proprietary, nationwide fast-charging infrastructure network and engineering battery packs with active liquid thermal management, they successfully neutralized the massive consumer anxiety surrounding range depletion. More importantly, they centralized the vehicle's entire operational architecture into a single massive touchscreen interface capable of receiving over-the-air software updates. Imagine, if you will, a scenario set in our current year of 2026 involving a typical American consumer named James. James is evaluating his transportation options and realizes that purchasing a traditional legacy vehicle means the software interface, the navigation system, and the driving dynamics are completely permanently frozen the precise second the vehicle rolls off the assembly line. It immediately begins to technologically age. Conversely, purchasing a highly advanced, software-defined electric vehicle means James will wake up to find his car has actively gained new features, improved range efficiency, or entirely new autonomous driving capabilities overnight while parked in his garage. This absolute paradigm shift from static mechanical hardware to dynamically evolving software completely paralyzed the Japanese automotive giants. Toyota, the undisputed king of global manufacturing, found themselves trapped in a massive sunk cost fallacy. They had heavily invested billions of dollars over decades into perfecting highly complex, dual-motor hybrid powertrains, epitomized by the incredibly successful Prius. They mathematically viewed hybrid technology as the ultimate, highly pragmatic bridge for the next 50 years of global transportation. Furthermore, they had heavily diverted massive research and development capital into hydrogen fuel cell technology, heavily lobbying global governments to build out hydrogen refueling infrastructure. Toyota executives publicly expressed deep skepticism regarding the massive critical mineral requirements, the severe grid infrastructure limitations, and the long-term environmental viability of massive battery electric vehicles. This profound philosophical resistance to fully electric propulsion caused them to severely delay their own battery development programs, effectively surrendering the absolute bleeding edge of automotive innovation to American startups and aggressive domestic competitors. However, while the Japanese automotive establishment stubbornly defended their hybrid supremacy and heavily lobbied against aggressive emissions mandates, the South Korean manufacturers identified a massive, highly lucrative opening. Hyundai and Kia, possessing extreme corporate agility and a ruthless desire to shed their lingering status as a secondary alternative to Honda and Toyota, executed a massive, highly coordinated pivot. They correctly assessed that attempting to beat the Japanese at complex hybrid engineering was a futile, decades-long battle. Instead, they completely bypassed the hybrid transitional phase and aggressively pushed all their chips into fully electric, heavily advanced architectures. This strategic maneuver resulted in the development of the Electric Global Modular Platform, a dedicated, highly scalable structural foundation designed exclusively for battery electric vehicles. The engineering specifications of this platform completely leapfrogged the entire Japanese industry. By implementing an ultra-advanced 800-volt electrical architecture, historically reserved strictly for exotic, heavily priced sports cars like the Porsche Taycan, the South Korean vehicles could accept massive influxes of direct current fast charging. They mathematically engineered the capability to replenish hundreds of miles of driving range in under 18 minutes, actively destroying the primary consumer objection to electric vehicle adoption. When they launched vehicles like the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6, they heavily disrupted the market with striking, retrofuturistic styling, massive interior volume allowed by the flat floorboard architecture, and software capabilities that legitimately rivaled the Silicon Valley pioneers. the South Korean conglomerates successfully transformed themselves from budget-friendly alternative options into the undisputed vanguards of mainstream, highly attainable electric vehicle technology in the United States. They capitalized on the massive Japanese hesitation, rapidly capturing critical early adopter market share and firmly establishing a highly dominant foothold in the next massive macroeconomic phase of American transportation. Their aggressive strategy proved that corporate survival in this new era requires absolute ruthlessness and a total willingness to completely abandon historically profitable technologies the moment a superior paradigm emerges. But this frantic, heavily capitalized arms race between the entrenched Asian legacy brands and the Silicon Valley disruptors is merely a regional skirmish preceding a massive, highly coordinated global invasion. While the United States market remains heavily fixated on the battle between Tesla, Hyundai, and a slowly awakening Toyota, a completely different, heavily subsidized, and ruthlessly efficient industrial titan has been quietly mathematically conquering the rest of the planet. They have achieved absolute total vertical integration, securing the entire global supply chain of critical battery minerals from the raw extraction in overseas mines to the final assembly of ultra-cheap, highly advanced consumer vehicles. And now, armed with an unprecedented structural cost advantage that defies traditional Western economic logic, they are actively maneuvering their massive corporate fleets directly toward the heavily protected borders of the American market, preparing to unleash a financial shockwave that could completely eradicate the domestic and legacy imported manufacturers once and for all. This monolithic industrial force is the heavily subsidized, aggressively expanding Chinese automotive sector, spearheaded by massive conglomerates like BYD, Geely, and NIO. To truly comprehend the absolute existential threat these companies pose to the entire global automotive hierarchy, we must fundamentally deconstruct their unique origin stories and their unprecedented structural advantages. Unlike legacy American, European, or even Japanese automakers, which were all founded on the mechanical mastery of the internal combustion engine and complex stamped steel, the vanguard of the Chinese automotive invasion did not begin by building cars at all. They began by building consumer electronics and, most importantly, the highly advanced lithium-ion batteries required to power them. BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, initially established itself as one of the largest manufacturers of rechargeable batteries for mobile phones in the world. They did not have to painfully learn how to adapt legacy mechanical factories to build highly volatile electric vehicle battery packs. Instead, they took their absolute supremacy in global battery manufacturing and simply engineered an automobile entirely around it. This is a profound architectural inversion of the traditional automotive manufacturing process. The historical trends of the global electric vehicle transition reveal a fatal structural flaw in the business models of legacy Western automakers. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and even the mighty Toyota operate under a deeply fragmented supply chain. When an American legacy automaker builds an electric vehicle, they typically have to purchase the critical, highly expensive battery cells from third-party global suppliers like LG Chem or Panasonic. Those suppliers, in turn, must purchase refined lithium, nickel, and cobalt from highly volatile global commodities markets. Every single step in this fractured supply chain introduces massive profit margin markups, exorbitant shipping costs, and severe geopolitical vulnerability. The Chinese conglomerates completely annihilated this vulnerability through the absolute mastery of total vertical integration. They actively control the entire life cycle of the electric vehicle from the very dirt in the ground to the final software update. These massive corporations, heavily backed by state-sponsored capital and aggressive industrial policy, strategically acquired massive equity stakes in lithium mines across South America and cobalt operations in Africa years before the Western world fully awakened to the electric transition. They physically extract the raw materials, load them onto massive cargo ships that they entirely own, refine the critical minerals in highly advanced domestic chemical plants, manufacture the individual battery cells, assemble the highly complex battery packs, and construct the final vehicle, all within a massive, heavily enclosed corporate ecosystem. This mathematically eliminates third-party profit margins and allows them to produce an electric vehicle at a structural cost advantage that completely defies traditional Western economic logic. Furthermore, we must rigorously analyze the specific, highly advanced battery chemistry that serves as the absolute foundation of their global dominance. While Western automakers heavily focused on complex nickel-manganese-cobalt battery chemistries to achieve maximum driving range, these specific batteries are highly expensive to manufacture and rely heavily on highly controversial, ethically fraught global supply chains for raw cobalt. Chinese manufacturers aggressively championed an alternative chemistry known as lithium iron phosphate. Historically dismissed by Western engineers as being too energy-dense and physically heavy for automotive applications, Chinese engineers heavily invested billions in research and development to structurally optimize this chemistry. The potential outcomes of this engineering gamble were industry-altering. Lithium iron phosphate batteries require absolutely zero expensive cobalt or nickel. They are dramatically cheaper to produce, mathematically possess a significantly longer structural lifespan, allowing for thousands of charge cycles with minimal degradation, and are fundamentally vastly safer, making them highly resistant to the catastrophic thermal runaway fires that have plagued Western electric vehicle models. Imagine, if you will, an incredibly common financial scenario occurring right now in our current year of 2026. Imagine a hardworking American consumer named Thomas. Thomas is deeply fatigued by the massive, highly unpredictable fluctuations in domestic gasoline prices and desperately wants to transition his family to a highly efficient electric vehicle. However, when Thomas visits a traditional legacy American or Japanese dealership, he is completely paralyzed by the massive financial barrier to entry, frequently encountering electric family crossovers priced well over $50,000. The monthly financing payments alone would completely destabilize his household budget. Now imagine if a highly sophisticated, heavily subsidized Chinese manufacturer could legally offer Thomas a mathematically superior electric vehicle, featuring hundreds of miles of driving range, hyper-advanced semi-autonomous driving capabilities, and an interior ecosystem that perfectly mirrors his smartphone, all for a retail price of $25,000. The sheer economic gravity of that price disparity would completely obliterate traditional brand loyalty. Thomas would fundamentally abandon the legacy brands he grew up with, because the financial preservation of his personal capital is infinitely more important than the badge sitting on the hood of the vehicle. This terrifying pricing disparity is the exact financial shockwave that currently has every single automotive executive in Detroit, Stuttgart, and Tokyo utterly terrified. They mathematically understand that if Chinese manufacturers are allowed completely unfettered access to the United States domestic market, the massive influx of heavily subsidized, structurally superior, and aggressively priced electric vehicles would trigger a mass extinction event for legacy automakers. They simply cannot compete on price without actively bankrupting their own massive corporations. To artificially delay this inevitable macroeconomic collision, the United States government has erected massive, heavily fortified legislative and economic walls. Through the aggressive implementation of 100% import tariffs on Chinese-manufactured electric vehicles and the highly stringent domestic sourcing requirements heavily embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act, the American market currently stands as a heavily protected fortress, specifically designed to starve these overseas conglomerates of highly lucrative American consumer capital. The government strategy is to strictly force the development of a localized, highly secure North American battery supply chain before the legacy automakers are completely wiped out. However, case studies in global trade clearly demonstrate that massive financial capital behaves exactly like water. It will always relentlessly seek the path of least resistance. The Chinese conglomerates fully recognize that a direct frontal assault on the American market is currently politically impossible. Therefore, they are meticulously executing a highly sophisticated, heavily funded Trojan horse strategy right on the southern border of the United States. By rapidly acquiring massive tracts of industrial real estate in northern Mexico and actively preparing to construct multi-billion-dollar, state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, they are perfectly positioning themselves to heavily exploit the highly complex legal frameworks of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. If they can successfully source a specific percentage of vehicle components locally within North America, they can mathematically bypass the massive import tariffs and flood the American market with aggressively priced vehicles assembled just a few miles south of the Texas border. This relentless, highly calculated maneuver perfectly echoes the exact same defensive strategies heavily utilized by the Japanese and South Korean manufacturers decades earlier, when they constructed massive assembly plants in the American South to bypass voluntary export restraints. But this modern iteration of the strategy is armed with infinitely more capital, a massive structural advantage in battery chemistry, and a highly aggressive timeline. As these massive foreign factories begin to break ground and the geopolitical tension reaches an absolute boiling point, the ultimate question is no longer if these vehicles will enter the American market, but precisely how the deeply entrenched legacy automakers and the American consumer will react when the absolute cheapest, highly advanced car in the world is suddenly sitting right next door, ready to completely rewrite the global rules of automotive ownership, leading us to examine the desperate, highly classified survival strategies currently being deployed in the deepest, most secure research facilities in Detroit. The desperate, highly classified survival strategies currently being deployed in the deepest, most secure research facilities in Detroit represent, arguably, the most profound corporate metamorphosis in the entire century-long history of American manufacturing. Detroit executives, historically insulated by the massive, highly lucrative profit margins generated almost exclusively by full-size pickup trucks and massive sports utility vehicles, are now mathematically cornered. The historical trends of slowly iterating on legacy internal combustion architectures are completely dead. They recognize that if they do not immediately fundamentally engineer a highly profitable, highly advanced electric vehicle capable of competing directly with aggressively priced imported models, they will be entirely eradicated from the mass-market passenger vehicle segment within a single generation. To achieve this seemingly impossible financial equation, domestic automotive manufacturers have completely bypassed their own massive, highly bureaucratic internal engineering departments. They recognize that the traditional corporate structure, severely burdened by thousands of middle managers and deeply entrenched legacy supply chains, was completely incapable of operating with the ruthless speed and agility required to intercept the impending Asian electric invasion. Therefore, they instituted highly classified, completely autonomous skunkworks teams. These Black Ops engineering divisions are physically separated from the main corporate campuses. They are staffed not strictly by traditional automotive veterans, but are heavily populated by brilliant aerospace engineers, advanced software developers poached directly from Silicon Valley, and ruthless mathematical supply chain analysts. Their singular, highly focused mandate is to deconstruct the fundamental cost of a battery electric vehicle down to the absolute molecular level. They are actively tearing down competitive imported vehicles piece by piece, conducting intense reverse engineering to meticulously understand exactly how overseas competitors are mathematically stripping thousands of dollars out of the manufacturing process without compromising structural integrity or consumer safety. Imagine, if you will, a highly experienced manufacturing engineer named William, working in our current year of 2026 inside one of these highly secure Detroit facilities. William spent the previous 20 years meticulously designing complex, exhaust manifolds and intricate fuel delivery systems for massive V8 engines. Now, his daily reality involves mathematically optimizing the exact structural casting of an electric vehicle underbody to completely eliminate hundreds of individual stamped steel parts. His objective is to replace them with a single massive piece of die-cast aluminum, heavily mirroring the revolutionary gigacasting techniques pioneered by highly agile startups and rapidly adopted by overseas conglomerates. If William and his heavily isolated team fail to mathematically solve this specific cost reduction equation, his entire massive legacy corporation faces the absolute certainty of catastrophic factory closures and the permanent termination of tens of thousands of American manufacturing jobs. The potential outcomes of this engineering challenge represent a binary survival state for the domestic industry. The core survival strategy heavily relies on the absolute eradication of structural complexity. Historically, legacy automakers offered hundreds of different build combinations, various engine options, endless interior trim levels, and complex wiring harnesses specifically tailored to each individual configuration. This massive complexity severely crippled their profit margins and heavily disrupted factory efficiency. The new survival mandate requires developing highly flexible, fully unified skateboard architectures. This means engineering a single highly advanced structural foundation containing the lithium-ion battery pack, the electric drive motors, and the core processing computers. This foundational platform can then be rapidly and cheaply scaled up or down to underpin everything from a compact commuter hatchback to a massive three-row family utility vehicle. By mathematically reducing the total part count of a vehicle by over 40%, Detroit aims to fundamentally offset the massive structural cost advantages currently held by fully vertically integrated Asian competitors. Furthermore, these legacy manufacturers are aggressively attempting to completely rewrite their historical revenue models. For an entire century, the primary financial transaction occurred at the dealership point of sale, followed by years of highly profitable maintenance revenues heavily captured by local service departments. But electric vehicles require fundamentally less mechanical maintenance. There are no engine oil changes, no complex multi-gear transmissions to continuously rebuild, and massive reductions in traditional brake pad were due to advanced regenerative braking systems. To survive this massive, permanent evaporation of service revenue, domestic automakers must transform the vehicle itself into a massive, rolling digital subscription service. We must deeply analyze the precise case studies of this software monetization strategy to understand the profound macroeconomic implications for the consumer. Legacy automakers are heavily investing billions of dollars into proprietary, highly advanced software operating systems. They intend to sell the base physical hardware of the vehicle at a remarkably low, highly competitive price, essentially utilizing the heavy metal as a massive loss leader to aggressively capture market share and defend their domestic territory. Once the vehicle is permanently sitting in the consumer's driveway, the manufacturer will heavily monetize the software ecosystem. Physical hardware features that were historically included in the base purchase price, such as advanced adaptive cruise control, heated seating elements, enhanced suspension dynamics, or even the maximum software unlocked battery range capacity, will be permanently locked behind highly profitable, continuously recurring monthly subscription paywalls. This highly controversial strategy represents a massive, fundamental transfer of long-term wealth from the working-class consumer directly back to the massive legacy corporations, mathematically converting a rapidly depreciating physical asset into a highly lucrative, multi-decade digital revenue stream. However, even with highly agile skunkworks teams and aggressive new software revenue models, the sheer magnitude of liquid capital required to successfully build a fully domestic North American battery supply chain is mathematically staggering. This intense financial pressure is currently forcing historically bitter, deeply entrenched domestic and international rivals to execute completely unprecedented corporate alliances. We are currently witnessing legacy American automakers actively forming massive, highly complex joint ventures with the very Japanese and South Korean battery manufacturers. They are simultaneously desperately trying to outpace in the retail market. They are pooling massive billions of dollars to rapidly construct hyper-advanced battery cell gigafactories across the American Midwest and the southern states. These massive joint ventures are not born out of corporate goodwill. They are heavily forced marriages born out of absolute, terrifying financial necessity and heavily incentivized by massive federal tax credits, explicitly designed to sever reliance on overseas critical mineral processing. As these massive corporate titans violently clash over global battery mineral rights, heavily protected supply chains, and highly lucrative software ecosystems, the average American consumer is currently trapped directly in the crossfire of this massive macroeconomic war. Purchasing a vehicle in this highly volatile transitional period requires a profound, highly analytical understanding of the underlying technologies and the hidden financial traps actively being deployed by every single manufacturer. If you purchase a legacy internal combustion vehicle today, you face the severe mathematical probability of catastrophic, accelerated depreciation as the entire global infrastructure aggressively pivots toward electric propulsion, rendering your vehicle a heavily stranded, highly illiquid asset. Conversely, if you purchase an early-generation electric vehicle from a legacy manufacturer that is actively bleeding billions of dollars on their transition, you face the severe risk of that massive corporation entirely abandoning that specific software architecture, leaving you permanently stuck with an unsupported, rapidly degrading technological orphan. The financial stakes have never been higher, and the margin for error for the American household budget is now practically non-existent. The final battlefield of this century-long automotive evolution has been permanently drawn, completely abandoning the historical metrics of mechanical horsepower and completely replacing them with the brutal, highly complex mathematics of software integration, battery chemistry lifespan, and absolute supply chain supremacy. As we stand on the precipice of this massive global reckoning, the ultimate victor of the American driveway will not simply be the manufacturer who builds the most reliable physical vehicle. It will be the massive conglomerate that successfully executes a highly aggressive macroeconomic maneuver designed to fundamentally permanently alter the psychological relationship between the American citizen and their transportation capital, setting the stage for the absolute final industry-shattering showdown that will permanently decide the total global economic fate of the automotive sector. This absolute final industry-shattering showdown that will permanently decide the total global economic fate of the automotive sector is not merely a battle over which factory produces the most vehicles. It is a fundamental war over the very concept of personal transportation ownership. For over a century, the macroeconomic model of the automotive industry was heavily reliant on the individual consumer, absorbing the massive capital expenditure of purchasing a depreciating physical asset. However, as we firmly navigate the highly volatile realities of our current year of 2026, the vanguard Asian manufacturers, alongside heavily capitalized technology conglomerates, are aggressively executing a paradigm shift known as transportation as a service. They are systematically attempting to transition the American consumer from an owner of capital into a permanent, lifelong subscriber to a heavily managed, heavily monitored autonomous mobility network. Imagine, if you will, the daily financial reality of a young professional named Emily, currently residing in a heavily congested American metropolitan center in 2026. Historically, Emily would be forced to allocate tens of thousands of dollars to purchase a physical vehicle, subsequently losing massive percentages of that invested capital to immediate depreciation, exorbitant insurance premiums, and unpredictable mechanical maintenance. Today, Emily is presented with a completely different, highly engineered alternative. A South Korean conglomerate, heavily leveraging their massive prior acquisition of advanced robotics firms, offers her a comprehensive monthly mobility subscription. For a flat, highly predictable monthly fee, Emily summons a fully autonomous, highly sanitized, aggressively aerodynamic electric pod directly to her apartment building precisely when she needs it. When she arrives at her destination, the vehicle autonomously departs to service another subscriber, completely eliminating the need for expensive urban parking infrastructure. If Emily chooses this mathematically logical path, she permanently preserves her liquid capital, but she simultaneously surrenders all physical equity and absolute control over her movement to a massive, centralized corporate algorithm. This potential outcome represents the complete, absolute inversion of the historical trends that originally brought Asian manufacturers to global dominance. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the absolute greatest financial weapon wielded by companies like Toyota and Honda was the undeniable mathematical reality of retained value. A consumer could purchase a Honda Civic, drive it aggressively for a decade, and accurately project exactly how much equity they would retain in the secondary market. That physical reliability built a multi-generational fortress of brand loyalty. However, in a software-defined, heavily subsidized autonomous ecosystem, physical reliability is no longer a consumer-facing selling point. It is strictly a corporate operational requirement. If the manufacturer entirely owns the fleet, they absorb the total cost of maintenance. Therefore, the battleground has completely shifted from building the longest-lasting physical engine to engineering the most highly efficient, ultra-fast charging, and structurally dense energy storage mechanism on the planet, leading directly to the single most critical technological race of the modern era. This highly classified race centers entirely on the successful commercialization of solid-state battery technology, and it represents the absolute final trump card for the entrenched Japanese legacy automakers. Toyota, having heavily resisted the initial wave of traditional lithium-ion electric vehicles, has quietly diverted billions of dollars in research and development capital into mathematically perfecting this advanced chemistry. To deeply understand the profound structural difference, we must analyze the internal architecture of a standard electric vehicle battery, which utilizes a highly volatile liquid electrolyte to facilitate the movement of ions between the cathode and the anode. This liquid is the primary cause of severe thermal runaway fires and heavily restricts the maximum speed at which the battery can absorb direct current fast charging. Toyota is aggressively engineering a massive structural replacement, completely eliminating the liquid electrolyte and replacing it with a mathematically precise solid ceramic or glass compound. The potential outcomes of fully commercialized solid-state batteries are completely terrifying for rival manufacturers relying on legacy architectures. A solid-state vehicle could theoretically offer over 700 miles of driving range on a single charge, physically weigh hundreds of pounds less than current models, and possess the mathematical capability to fully recharge from 0 to 100% in under 10 minutes, effectively mirroring the historical convenience of the traditional gasoline pump. If Toyota successfully scales this highly complex manufacturing process before the heavily subsidized Chinese conglomerates fully saturate the American domestic market, they will instantly render millions of first-generation lithium-ion electric vehicles structurally obsolete overnight. This would trigger a massive, highly destructive wave of unprecedented capital depreciation for early electric vehicle adopters, completely destabilizing the secondary market and firmly re-establishing Japanese engineering supremacy in the exact market they initially seemed highly reluctant to enter. When we critically examine the complete, sweeping evolution of Asian car models in the American market, We are witnessing arguably the most brilliant, methodically executed corporate conquest in the history of modern capitalism. It began in 1957 with the fundamentally flawed, heavily mocked Toyota Crown, a vehicle that literally shook itself to pieces on American highways. Through decades of ruthless operational efficiency, the brilliant psychological maneuvering of luxury brand creation, the highly strategic transfer of mechanical liability through massive warranties, and the aggressive poaching of elite European design talent, these massive overseas conglomerates systematically dismantled the deeply entrenched arrogance of the Detroit establishment. They did not just learn how to compete in the American market, they entirely rewrote the fundamental physical, financial, and psychological rules of what an automobile represents to the global consumer. Today, as the global automotive industry violently transitions into a completely uncharted macroeconomic reality defined by ultra-advanced software architecture, highly volatile critical mineral supply chains, and the terrifying prospect of fully autonomous subscription networks, the original Asian pioneers find themselves locked in a massive existential war against heavily subsidized, digitally native disruptors. The American consumer is no longer merely purchasing transportation. They are actively allocating their deeply limited capital into highly complex, rapidly evolving digital ecosystems that are specifically designed to continuously extract wealth over the entire lifecycle of the product. Navigating this treacherous financial landscape requires absolute vigilance, deeply rigorous analytical research, and a profound, highly objective understanding of the massive corporate forces actively fighting for control of your driveway. But while we have spent this entire exhaustive documentary deeply analyzing the exact physical engineering, the highly calculated brand psychology, and the massive financial architectures of the vehicles themselves, we have completely ignored the single most dangerous vulnerability currently being installed in millions of American garages. These highly advanced, software-defined rolling supercomputers are continuously quietly harvesting massive, unprecedented volumes of your deeply personal, highly sensitive biometric and geographical data. And the highly classified, incredibly lucrative secondary market where your personal data is actively being weaponized and sold to the highest bidder by these very same multinational conglomerates leads us directly into a terrifying new reality that we must urgently uncover in our next massive investigation.